The morning of a believer is not just the beginning of a new day, it is a sacred opportunity gifted by Allah, a fresh page in the book of life, a renewed chance to worship, to repent, to seek goodness, and to strive for Jannah. And so when a Muslim opens his eyes in the early hours, his first thought is not about the phone, the world, or the tasks awaiting him, but about the one who gave him life after sleep. For the Prophet taught us that sleep is like a form of death, and waking up is like being resurrected. So the very first words that escape the lips of a believer are praises to Allah, saying that all praise is due to Allah, who gives life after causing us to die, and to Him is the return. And this moment sets the tone for the entire day, because gratitude in the first breath will invite blessings into every step thereafter, and the believer understands that the morning is not time for heedlessness, but a time for remembrance. For in the Qur'an, Allah tells us to remember Him much in the morning and in the evening. And so before even leaving the bed, the believer begins to move his lips in quiet dhikr, whispering the praises of the Most High, thanking Him for health, for safety, for guidance, and for the gift of another day to do good. And as he rises from the bed, he is conscious of the sunnah of using the right hand, of making the short supplications the Prophet made upon waking, of cleansing the mouth with the miswak if possible. For the mouth that will recite Qur'an and speak deserves to be purified from the start of the. And then believer reflects that the early hours are the most blessed, because the Prophet prayed for barakah in the early morning for his ummah, and so he resisted temptation to remain in bed, knowing that morning is the time when angels witness the acts of worship, when the mind is clear, when the heart is soft, and when the soul is closest to sincerity. And thus he makes wudu with mindfulness, feeling the cool water wash away minor sins from his face, his hands, his limbs, and preparing his body and spirit for the meeting with his Lord. And during the wudu, he remembers that every dropper that falls is cleansing him not just physically but spiritually, making him ready to stand in front of the King of Kings. And as he finishes the wudu, he recites the dua for completion, seeking that the gates of paradise be opened for him. And now the world around him is still silent. The darkness still lingers before dawn. But in his heart is light, the light of Iman, the awareness that he is among those whom Allah wakes up to stand before him while others are asleep. And so he spreads his prayer mat facing the Qibla, and if Allah has granted him the tawfiq, he engages in Tahajjud, the night prayer that the Prophet loved so dearly, the prayer that is a sign of sincerity, the prayer that connects a servant Allah in the deepest way. And he stands reciting verses that remind him of the greatness of Allah, verses that soften the heart, verses that remind him of the temporary nature of this life. And in sujud he pours his heart, telling Allah his fears, hopes, his regrets, and his dreams. For the closest a servant is to his Lord is in prostration. And this is the moment to ask for forgiveness, for guidance, for ease in matters, protection from the whisper of Shaitan, for blessings in his sustenance, and for steadfastness in faith. And as he prays, he knows that angels are recording every word, every tear, every intention, and that this moment is a shield for the rest of his day. And when the time for Fajr approaches, he prepares himself mentally and physically to answer the call of Allah, not delaying, not making excuses, for Fajr is the test of sincerity. And the Prophet told us that whoever prays Fajr is under the protection of Allah. So the believer values this salah above sleep, above comfort of laziness. And even if it is cold or the bed is warm, he knows that success lies in obeying Allah. And as he has the adhan or sees the time, he remembers to repeat after the Mu'adhin, sending blessings upon the Prophet, and then making dua for the intercession of the messenger on the day of judgment. And if he is able to attend the masjid, he leaves with humility, walking calmly yet purposefully, knowing that every step raising his rank and erasing his sins. And if he prays at home, he ensures he prays with khushu, standing with full concentration, removing all distractions, and after completing the 2 sunnah rakat of Fajr, he reflects on the words of the Prophet that these 2 units are better than the world and all it contains, and so he does not rush them, but recites with tranquility, feeling the meaning of the verses, letting of Allah enter his heart. And then, when the Iqamah is called, he stands for the obligatory Fajr prayer, knowing that this is a pillar of Islam, that it is the first of the daily prayers, that it sets the standard for the rest of the day. And he feels honored to be among those who begin their day with obedience to the Creator. And after completing the prayer, he remains seated, engaging in Adhkar, praising Allah, seeking forgiveness, reciting Ayatul Kursi, the last surahs, and any supplications the Prophet would make. And in this moment, he feels peace, because he knows that he has fulfilled his duty at the start of the day. And this peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of Allah's mercy in the heart. And from here, the believer can step into a world with clarity, with purpose, and with the conviction that as long as he keeps Allah first in his day, Allah will take care of the rest. And thus the morning of a Muslim is not just about routine, it is about renewal, about starting again with sincerity, about making every sunrise a reminder that the real dawn will be the day we meet our Lord, and that every breath until then is an opportunity to prepare for that meeting. And so the believer's morning is filled with light, with gratitude, with discipline, and with the awareness that every day could be his last, and therefore every day should be his best. After the believer has completed the blessed Fajr prayer and engaged in the morning Adhkar, his heart feels alive and his spirit feels connected to Allah in a way that cannot be described in worldly terms, because this connection is a gift that no amount of wealth, fame, or status can purchase. It is the peace that Allah places in the hearts of those who remember Him. And as the soft light of dawn begins to spread, the believer understands that the early hours are not to be wasted in idle talk, unnecessary distractions, or neglect, but rather to be filled with actions that bring him closer to his Creator and set the tone for the entire day. And so he made sure to remain seated after Fajr, reciting Qur'an, reflecting upon its meanings, because the Qur'an in the early morning carries a special witness, as Allah mentions that the recitation of Fajr is witnessed by the angels, and this is the time when the mind is clear, the heart is undistracted, and the soul is receptive to guidance. And as the believer recites, he reflects not only on the words, but on the application in his life, asking himself how he can live these verses, how he can embody the commands, and how he can avoid the warnings. For the Qur'an was not revealed to be recited only with the tongue, but be acted upon with the heart and limbs. And as he sits in this peaceful state, he may also choose to engage in silent reflection, thinkings about his goals for the day, the intentions he has set, and how each action can be turned into an act of worship if is done for the sake of Allah. And here lies the beauty of Islam, that the morning routine is not simply a checklist of rituals, but a spiritual alignment of the heart and mind, so that everything that follows is in the service of Allah, whether it is earning a living, serving the family, seeking knowledge, or helping community. And as the sun rises, the believer remembers the immense reward of remaining in remembrance until the sun has fully risen, and then offering 2 units of prayer, which the Prophet promised would be equal in reward to performing Hajj and Umrah completely. And so he values this time and treats it as a gift, because in this short span, he can gain rewards that may outweigh years of effort in other ways. And while the world outside is still awakening, he has already filled his soul with light and his scales with deeds. And then he considers the role of Tahajjud in his routine. For even if he could not wake up before Fajr on some days, he knows that the voluntary prayers and dies in early morning, carry and weight unlike any other. Because Allah descends in a manner befitting His Majesty in the last third of the night, and calls out to His servants asking, "Who is there to ask me so I may give him? Who is there to seek my forgiveness so I may forgive him?" And so the believer strives to make this a part of his life, even if it's just 2 rakat, knowing that sincerity in small deeds is better than abundance without sincerity. And when he engages in his prayers, his does flow with honesty, because in the quiet of the early morning, there are no masks, no pretenses. Just a servant speaking to his Lord about everything in his heart, asking for protection from sin, for guidance in decisions, for strength in trials, for blessings in sustenance, and for entry into paradise without reckoning. And this private conversation becomes the anchor of his day, giving him strength to face whatever comes. And when he reflects on the son of the Prophet, he remembers that the Messenger of Allah would start his day by ensuring that his spiritual duties were completed before tending to his worldly matters, teaching us that priority as believer is always the hereafter first, then the dunya. And so the believer examines his own schedule, ensuring that he does not begin his work or studies before fulfilling the remembrance, the does and the Qur'an recitation that will bring him barakah in those activities. And then, as the morning advances, he ensures that his tongue remains moist with remembrance, whether he's walking, driving, saying some breakfast, saying sabun amjule alahula, lallahu ilala, Allahu Akbar, and seeking forgiveness. Because the Prophet said that the one who starts his day with such remembrance will find his affairs made easy. And this habit protects the heart from the whispers of Shaitan, who tries to attack in the early hours when laziness and distraction can creep in. And the believer is aware the morning is also a time to seek sustenance in a halal way, to plan his efforts, and to begin with the name of Allah, saying Bismillah before every task. Because without the blessing of Allah, no effort will bring true benefit. And so whether he is going to work, attending classes, or running errands, he begins with an intention that transforms ordinary actions into acts of worship, reminding himself that Islam is a complete way of life and not limited to the masjid. And he guards him from wasting the early hours on social media, idle browsing, or meaningless chatter, because he knows time is one of the greatest blessings and one of the most asked out matters on the Day of Judgment. And in this way, the believer's morning is one of discipline, where he does not allow the phone to be the first thing he touches, but allows the remembrance of Allah to be the first nourishment for his soul. And he remains conscious that his morning routine will shape his productivity, his mood, and his spiritual state for the rest of the day. And if he maintains this connection with Allah in the early hours, he will find himself more patient, more focused, and more content throughout whatever trials or tasks come his way. And thus the believer values these hours as treasures, storing up deeds before the sun reaches its peak. For he knows that the one who starts his day with Allah will end his day with Allah's mercy. After setting his heart upon the remembrance of Allah and securing his morning with prayer, Qur'an, and reflection, the believer knows that his day will be shaped by how he nurtures his relationship with his Creator in these early hours. And so he takes the time after Fajr to truly contemplate his blessings. Because gratitude is the key that unlocks contentment, and the more one thanks Allah, the more Allah increases his favors, as promised in the Qur'an. And this moment of reflections is not just a fleeting thought, but a deliberate act of the heart, where he looks around and sees the gift of health, the ability to walk and speak, the food on the table, the shelter above his head, the loved ones in his life, and above all, the gift of guidance to Islam, which surpasses every worldly blessing. And in this quiet moment, he raises his hands and thanks Allah not only for what is obvious, but also for the unseen protections, the harms of the opportunities granted, the strength given in trials, and the hidden blessings that he may never even realize. And this gratitude is followed by a renewed sense of purpose. Because a Muslim's mourning is not merely about rituals, but by aligning the heart so that every action to come will be rooted in faith. And the believer recalls that the Prophet would never begin his day without setting a clear intention. For actions are judged by intentions, and with the right intention, even the simplest act becomes an act of worship. So as he plans his work, his studies, or his duties for the day, he says in his heart, "I do this for the sake of Allah." And in that moment, his day transforms into a journey toward Allah. And part of this journey is ensuring that the morning is free from sin. Because starting the day with disobedience darkens the heart and invites difficulty, while starting with obedience invites ease and blessing. And so the believer is mindful of his tongue, choosing words of kindness and truth, avoiding gossip, insults, or falsehood. And even in moments of silence, he guards his thoughts, seeking Allah's help to avoid envy, arrogance, or ill intentions. For the heart is where every action begins, and the early morning is the best time to purify it. And alongside this spiritual guarding, the believer also takes care of his physical well-being. For the body is an amanah entrusted to him by Allah, and the Prophet taught us that our body has a right over us. So after prayer and remembrance, he may choose to engage in form of physical movement, a short walk to the masjid or a light exercise, breathing in the fresh morning air and remembering the Prophet's dua for good health and strength. Because Ahadi aids in worship, fasting service to others, and enduring trials, and while caring for his body, he also ensures that his sust for the day is pure and halal, starting his breakfast with the name of Allah, mindful the sunnah to eat in moderation, to share food when possible, and to avoid extravagance, because eating with mindfulness is also an act of worship. And as the believer sits to eat, he may remember that there are millions without the blessings he enjoys, and so he makes dua for them. Perhaps setting aside a portion as wealth regularly to help those in need. For charity given in the morning extinguishes sins like water extinguishes fire. And it draws the mercy of Allah to one's day. And after fulfilling his worship, his gratitude, his physical care, and his intention setting, the believer begins his worldly activities with the mindset that they are all part of his deen. Knowing that the messenger taught that the strong believer is more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, not only in faith but in effort, discipline, and service. And as he steps into responsibilities, he keeps Allah's remembrance alive in his heart, whether through tasbih, istighfar, or silent dua. For the one who remembers Allah while working is the one who truly lives with purpose. And when challenges arise in the day, he does not react with haste or anger, because his morning connection with Allah has equipped him with patience. And he remembers the supplications of the Prophet for protection from the evil of the day, from laziness, from cowardice, from miserliness, and from the burden of debt. And this shielding is what keeps him steadfast when others may falter. And so by mid-morning, while many are just beginning to find their rhythm, the believer has already filled his soul with light, his heart with peace, and his scales with deeds. And this is why the morning of a Muslim is so transformed, because it sets the believer on a path where every hour that follows is anchored in worship. Every word is measured, every intention is purified, and every step is guided by the awareness that Allah sees him, hears him, and knows what is in his heart. And so even if the day ahead is filled with tasks, meetings, travels, or challenges, the believer moves forward with the certainty that the one who guided him in the morning will guide him until the night, and with that, he begins his day fully carrying the tranquility of dawning into the heat of the afternoon, and the lessons of Fajr into every decision, until the day comes when his final morning arrives, and he wakes not to call of Fajr, but to the call of the angels who will take his soul. And on that day, he will be grateful for every morning he began with Allah, for is those mornings that will lead him to an eternal morning in the gardens of paradise. As the morning progresses and the sun begins to rise higher, the believer remains conscious that the barakah, the early hours, is a trust that should be used wisely. For the Prophet made dua for blessings in the mornings for his ummah, and blessings are preserved by guarding time, avoiding laziness, and ensuring that no part of this precious window is wasted on things that bring no benefit in this world or the next. And so the believer organizes his morning with intentionality, knowing that productivity is also a form of worship when done the right intention. And he plans his tasks so that the most important and difficult matters are addressed while the mind is still fresh and the heart is still connected to Allah. Because starting the day with discipline and clarity is part of the prophetic way. And as he engages in his duties, whether it be seeking knowledge, working to earn a halal living, caring for family, or serving the community, he keeps in mind that every action can be turned into an act of worship if done sincerely for Allah's sake. And so he begins each task with asking Allah for ease, guidance, and success. And if an obstacle arises, he says, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, reminding himself that nothing happens without Allah's decree. And in doing so, his heart remains calm and anchored, free from the panic that overtakes those who forget their Lord. And in these hours, he also protects his eyes from what is haram, for the sight is a gateway to the heart. And guarding it preserves the purity he began his day with. And he guards ears from gossip, backbiting, and falsehood, preferring instead to listen to beneficial reminders or the recitation of the Qur'an. Because what we feed our hearts in the morning will shape thoughts and feelings for the rest of the day. And in this awareness, the believer is selective about his environment, surrounding himself with that which nourishes his soul. Even means being alone with Allah rather than in the company of those who pull him toward heedlessness. And while fulfilling his worldly responsibilities, he also maintains his spiritual responsibilities, making sure to pause for the duha prayer before midday. For this prayer is a source of great reward and was a practice of the Prophet, who taught that it serves as a form of gratitude for every joint in the body. And in these rak'at, the believer humbles himself again, reconnecting with Lord of the morning, asking for his guidance, his protection. And in between, he may also give charity, even if it is a small amount. For the Prophet said that charity does not decrease wealth. And giving in the morning is like planting seeds that will grow throughout the day, bringing blessings in ways one cannot imagine. And the believer also understands that the morning is a time to set the tone for the family. So he greets them with warmth, reminds them gently of their prayers, encourages them toward good habits, and makes dua for their success in both worlds. Because the family's mourning together can either be a source of unity and blessing or a time of neglect that leaves hearts distant. And so the believer strives to be a source of positivity in his home, leading by example in kindness, patience, and discipline. And even in his conversations, he avoids starting the day with complaints or negativity, choosing instead to speak words of hope and encouragement. For the Prophet's speech was always filled with goodness, and part of following his sunnah is to spread light in the lives of those around us, especially in the early hours when people are setting their emotional tone for the day. And in maintaining this, the believer also remembers that his own soul needs nourishment beyond worship alone. So he may engage in a moment of learning in the morning, reading a beneficial book, listening to an inspiring lecture, or studying a hadith, because knowledge in the morning penetrates the mind more deeply and stays longer. And the Prophet taught that seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. So the believer makes this a priority, even is just a few minutes a day, for consistency is more beloved to Allah than abundance without continuity. And as the ask toward midday, the believer reflects on how his morning has unfolded, checking whether he has maintained his connection with Allah, whether his tongue has stayed in dhikr, whether his tasks have been done with sincerity, and whether his interactions have been pleasing to Allah. Because self-reflection keeps the heart humble and aware, and if he finds any shortcomings, he makes immediate istighfar. For seeking forgiveness wipes away mistakes before they accumulate. And by living with this awareness, the believer ensures that the morning is not just a ritualistic routine, but a spiritual foundation that supports him until the evening. And he knows that no matter how busy the day becomes, starting it with the remembrance of Allah means that he carries a shield of barakah, a protection that keeps his heart safe from despair, his mind safe from distraction, and his soul safe from the traps of Shaitan. And thus, the morning of a Muslim is a treasure chest filled with worship, discipline, gratitude, productivity, and compassion, all rooted in the awareness that life is short, that every sunrise brings him closer to his final sunset, and that the one who begins engage with Allah will one day awaken in a morning where there is no sunset in the eternal gardens of Jannah, where mornings are filled with joy, peace, and the pleasure of the Most Merciful. As the believer moves from the stillness of dawn toward the busyness of the day, he carries with him the treasures he gathered in the early hours, the purity of wadhu, the sweetness of tahajjud, the tranquility of fajr, the light of Qur'an, the strength of dhikr, and the focus of intention. He knows that this morning connection is not meant to be left behind once the sun rises, but to be extended, carried, and protected until the evening. For the one who begins with Allah and with Allah lives Allah barakah, no matter what trials or tests lie in between. And so he guards the barakah of his morning like a priceless gem, refusing to let sin, heedlessness, or negative company steal it away. And when tasks come, he remembers that time is also a form of sustenance from Allah, and wasting it without purpose is like throwing away provision. So he is mindful to fill his hours with what benefits him in dunya and akhirah, and in doing so, he feels the difference between a day that begins with heedlessness and a day that begins with remembrance. For the first is heavy, distracted, and restless, while the second is light, focused, and content. And part of protecting this state is returning to Allah in small ways throughout the morning, renewing wadhu when needed, pausing for short does, remembering Allah silently in the heart, and maintaining patience when tested, because the Prophet taught us that patience is light. And in the morning light, patience shines brightest when the believer chooses calmness over anger, grace over complaint, and trust in Allah over anxiety. And in his interactions, whether at work, school, or within the home, he keeps his speech honest and gentle. For the Prophet said that whoever believes in Allah and the last day should speak good or remain silent. And he reminds himself that the words he says in the morning can influence someone's entire day. So he strives to make them a source of comfort, guidance, and motivation, not to harm. And alongside this, he keeps a sense of humility, never becoming arrogant about his worship or thinking himself better than others. For the one who prays Fajr in congregation is not superior because of his own merit, but because Allah granted him the tawfiq to do so. And knowing this keeps him sincere, for sincerity is the soul of worship, without which even the most disciplined routine becomes hollow. And part of sincerity is also making room for mercy in the schedule, So the believer does not rush through his worship in the morning as if it were a burden, but treats it as an honor, a privilege, and a means of conversing with the Lord of the worlds. And as the day unfolds, he keeps reflecting on the Prophet's own morning, simple yet filled with remembrance, unhurried yet full of purpose, never burdened with unnecessary distractions, always anchored in the consciousness of Allah. And he realizes that following this example not only draws him closer to Allah, but also brings inner peace in a world that constantly chases speed and noise. And if there are days when his morning routine falters, he does not let Shaitan convince him to give up, but rather returns the next morning with even more determination, seeking forgiveness for what was missed and making dua for consistency. Because Allah loves the deeds that are consistent even if small. And so the believer trains himself to value quality over quantity, presence of heart over mechanical habit, and meaning over mindless repetition. For the morning routine of a Muslim is not meant to be a rigid checklist, but a living relationship with Allah that breathes meaning into every sunrise. And over time, he notices how his mornings transform his character, how the stillness of pre-dawn teaches him patience, how the discipline of prayer strengthens his self-control, how the remembrance of Allah polishes his heart, and how the early hours free him from the grip of worldly stress. And he becomes grateful for this transformation, realizing that true purpose of a morning routine is not only to prepare the body for the day, but to prepare the soul for the eternal day that will never end, the day of judgment. And when he reflects on that reality, he understands that every morning he wakes is one morning closer to standing before Allah. And so he treats each dawn as if it might be his last, ensuring that if he does not live to see another sunrise, this one will bear witness for him, not against him. And he prays the angels who record his actions. Fajr will write him among those who began their day in obedience, sincerity, and love for their Creator. And that when his final morning comes, it will mirror the mornings he lived on earth, filled with remembrance, with gratitude, with hope in Allah's mercy, and with readiness to meet him. With that awareness, he rises each day with the words of the Prophet in his heart. "O Allah, whatever blessing have been received by me or anyone from your creation is from you alone. You have no partner, so for you is all praise, and for you all thanks." And as the sunlight streams into his life, so too does the light of faith, carrying him from one day to the next until the day when morning is no longer measured by the rising sun, but by the eternal light of Jannah, where the mornings never fade and the peace never ends, and where the one who began his days with Allah will spend endless mornings in his presence, in gardens beneath which rivers flow, greeted with the words, "A peace be upon you for what you patiently endured, and excellent is the final home." Amen.